Of you, my philosophy is that we should not punish those who have on time for the sake of those who are lazy or distracted or not on time. Great, welcome. It's the last day, but I can assure you that you are in for a treat. My name is Jamil Saoumi. I have the privilege of having been asked by UNESCO to coordinate one of the 10 themes of this conference, namely equity and inclusion. And this is the official roundtable for this theme. And with me today, I'm very honored to have 4 distinguished persons who have made impressive contributions to this theme that is so important for mankind as a whole, for our countries, for the students in our respective countries. I'm going to present them from the left to the right. So far left, and that corresponds to her geographical location as well, we have Nadine Zacharias, who hails from Australia. She's been involved both as a researcher, studying equity policies in Australia, and you will hear from her. Australia is really a leader in this field. I did a study on behalf of the Lumina Foundation a few years back, and I identified a few champions: England, Ireland, Cuba, and Australia. So I'm very glad that Nadine is here with us today to share her experience. Next, we have Nima. Your last name I haven't learned yet, Nima. Shame on me.
It's okay.
If you can remind me. Nima Juma from Tanzania. Nima is an academic working at prestigious institutions in Africa. It's called the Nelson Mandela University of Science and Technology. It's a multi-country initiative to develop STEM higher education in Africa. But more importantly, she's here today because she was distinguished through a prize from L'Oréal UNESCO. She launched an NGO that has been very successful to promote STEM education for women, and she will tell us more about her experience. And to my right, we have Veronica Figueroa Huancho. As you know, from Chile. As you know, Chile has a new government, very young, not only because it's only 2 months old, but because the new president is 36?
Five, six, yes,
Yeah.
yes, he's really.
And he has surrounded himself with young people, but who have lots of experience, which is really the case of Veronica, who today is like the Vice Minister for Higher Education. But before that, she's had a long and distinguished career as an academic, as a researcher, and her theme has been really to work on behalf of public policies to promote education for indigenous people. Many more things to say, but I'm just going to the... And last but not least, we have Father Harold Castillo de Vos, who is the rector, the president of a very interesting university in Colombia called Uniminuto, and I won't tell you more because he will share with us the experience of this institution. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Veronica to start us. The guidelines that I've given them are 10 minutes, a brief 10-minute presentation, 4 of them, so that we have half of our session dedicated to a conversation with you, hearing your questions, your comments, and having our panelists talk about them. Veronica, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having invited me to be here. First of all, I'd like to express my thanks for giving me the chance to be able to speak about this very important issue and to be able to bring my language and my greetings. I'm Mapuche. I'm not only a woman, but also Mapuche. Mari Mari Compuche.
Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you for the invitation as well to give us the chance to be able to engage in this very important dialogue about this issue, which sets out a very important question to us concerning higher education, which is, what value do we believe higher education has in promoting more fair societies, one which is more equal, a society that offers sustainable development, but also keeps in mind human rights. And so the question that we're asking ourselves today in Chile is, who are those people involved in higher education, and who do we want to be in higher education but is not yet there? This brings us to having to think about the challenges that we're facing today in Chile in the domain of higher education. Quite clearly, there has been an increase in access to higher education in Chile. We've gone from about 25,000 students at the beginning of the 60s, the 1960s, of course, to almost 1,300,000 people in 2021. So we're talking about the fact that today millions more people have access to higher education. Nevertheless, if we do a disaggregation, or if we don't look at the disaggregated data, this could give us a distorted idea of what's going on, because we've seen there hasn't been a balance in who has access. We've seen that, of course, the richest sectors have had access to higher education, and those who of a more vulnerable socioeconomic level have greater difficulty in access to higher education for various reasons. First of all, the access systems to higher education were standardized. They're based on measuring specific knowledge. Therefore, it benefits those students who come from private schools or who are able to pay to prepare them for the tests that they are required to take to have access to higher education. People coming from more vulnerable socioeconomic levels had problems not only in access to higher education, but in staying. And then there's also the costs involved, the cost of higher education. Our system does not offer free higher education, although we have something similar to that, so I'll be giving you a bit more detail about how that works. Then we also have the problem of debt in families that generates problems for them in being able to access higher education. 2 of 3 households in Chile have debts of one kind or another, and it is actually educational debts that occupy the greatest amount of those debts they have, meaning that this is a huge financial load for many families. Another challenge we have as well is dealing with diversity, the diversity we have in our society, diversity that can be seen in gender, in the existence of indigenous peoples, sexual diversity, people with disabilities, meaning people who have different know-how, knowledge, bodies, languages, and they are not occupying the space they should in higher education, which means that we are losing a possibility to look at each other, understand each other, to take a look and have a perspective on the world, including the perspective of those people who are being excluded, and sometimes in a permanent way, from these spaces. If we talk specifically about women, there has been an increase in their access to higher education over the last decades, and yet, nevertheless, there are still certain certain lines of study that are associated with women specifically, and that have less employability afterwards, or in which they will earn less money than men do. So we can see, for example, that the majority of women in 2021 got degrees in studies related to healthcare, especially nursing, whereas almost 50% of the men did that or had studies related to technology. When we talk about indigenous peoples, we're almost 13% of the population according to the most recent census, and yet we still have problems in having access to higher education because there is no recognition of our rights, in particular our political rights, and this has an impact on access to higher education. There's a migrant population as well that we need to talk about. That's been increasing in recent years in Chile, but they also have difficulty in having access to higher education, either because they don't have permanent residence in the country or because they don't have access to grants, to subsidies. And then, of course, there's people with disabilities. Although in Chile we have a law that says that higher education institutions must make their physical structures, spaces, and systems accessible to people with disabilities, that doesn't always happen. It depends on how much will the institution actually has to carry that out. So we have many challenges to be dealt with. And our government, which we consider to be a feminist government, well, a feminist government, when it works in political spaces, must understand that society has a way of structuring power and knowledge and distributing that throughout society, which has not been equitable, which has not been fair. So if we can work from a feminist perspective, we will be working towards offering a more just society and working on eliminating this lack of equality from the spaces of higher education. That's part of our political perspective of our government, which must also take into account the idea of intersectionality, because we know it's not enough to be just a woman or an indigenous population or a person with disability or to be from a rural environment, but sometimes all of these aspects can come together, and that's when multiple discrimination can occur. In Chile, we've had this happen in a very complex way, and in 2018, we saw a huge amount of social mobilization that up to this day we're talking about a new constitution, and that has had, I believe, a significant impact on the fact that my government had access to power. So we have certain terms as well. We've been beginning with a certain intersectional-based policy in my government. Firstly, in the way in which we understand the universal or free nature of education. So we have state education, state higher education in Chile, but that budget is distributed amongst private and public universities. The paradox here is that although the educational budget is 1.4% of the GDP, most of that has gone to the private universities. Of every 3 Chilean pesos that we invest in higher education, at least 2 go to private education institutions. One way to change this was by setting up this system of free education, which is understood as a right that students have, those students who have a more vulnerable socioeconomic situation, that is to say those who are in the 70% most vulnerable. But this is actually a voucher that's given to the student. The student can then choose what university they want to attend, and this has led to a certain competition between universities in Chile. So those universities which are more competitive or which have a better reputation have limits on letting these students in, because those students, those 60% that are more vulnerable that I mentioned before, don't always pass sufficiently the test that would give them access to the higher education institutions. The quality of our universities can be quite different as well. We have an access program to higher education, which is a program that we called PASE. This PASE program is focused on students that come from the most vulnerable socioeconomic levels of society and offers support at the university to those students who are in their last years of their of the upper secondary education that gives them access to universities. And although this program has worked quite well, we haven't been able to actually establish a correlation between access to the universities via this special path and people actually graduating from university at the end and being able to get a job. So we have to see whether or not our way of understanding the system is actually working properly in terms of keeping into account the intersectional perspective as well. We have one test for access to higher education. It has measured contents above all, but we're trying to move towards a test that will measure skills as well, abilities, and that will also take into account people's experience, their past, and their context. Up until now, we've had an average of the best grades, and it's been men who have come from the best private schools and from the capital that have had the best average points on these tests. But if we don't take into account this intersectional nature that I was mentioning, then we won't improve people's chance to have access to these spaces. So we've set up another system to evaluate people's background and context, and so it depends. They can get more points depending on if they have a certain disability, if they're from a native population, if they come from a different model of teaching, and then it takes into account men, women, and of course we also have to work for taking into account sexual diversity as well. So to close up, we have a series of challenges about how we're going to guarantee that access is equitable and fair to people with disabilities. Generally, people apply online, and there have been some people that can't fill out the online form, the standardized online form, because of their disability, or can, but later they get into the university and don't have the infrastructure in place that they require. So there's a lot of challenges in Chile for us right now. To sum up, we're a society which suffers from great levels of inequality. It has not recognized the diversity that we have. And in my position as Subsecretary of Education, of Higher Education, we're working to make sure that we can contribute towards greater democracy. Leadership based on citizenship, plurinationality, and feminism, and all of that to be taken account in the higher education system. How can we guarantee that the proper decisions are taken over the next 10, 20, 30 years that contribute to creating a fairer society based on sustainable development and with a focus on human rights?
I know there is so much to say about the situation and the priorities that your government has put on the agenda, but we are constrained by time, and I would like to give the floor now to Nima Mduma, who is going to talk about her experience in Tanzania. So we're moving from national public policies to grassroots initiatives from dedicated people like Nima. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Nima Mduma. I'm a lecturer in the field of machine learning and artificial intelligence. I'm also a winner of UNESCO Award for Young Talents in Sub-Saharan Africa in the year 2020. And I'm the founder of Bakishule Initiative, which aims at promoting science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to girls in secondary schools in Tanzania. The idea of starting Bakishule, which is a Swahili word for stay at school, came up when I was doing my PhD, which focused on addressing the problem of student dropout in secondary schools using machine learning. I then realized that there are fewer girls taking science subjects as compared to boys, and still drop out of studies despite being few. The issue of women underrepresentations in science is attributed by several factors, such as first, the issue of gender bias, because it is believed that women will not excel well in science. Also, in most cases, women are required to either balance or choose between family, social life, and work, particularly science careers. And thirdly, low self-confidence due to communities' perceptions towards women in science, which creates fears and discourages many women to study science. Therefore, I saw an urgent need to promote STEM in secondary schools, means from the lower level of career development. So what I do basically is organizing sensitization events, free trainings, inspirational talks, workshops, science fairs, and exhibitions in secondary schools in order to encourage girls to pursue science and expose them to fields such as machine learning, data science, and artificial intelligence. Specifically, I have targeted these fields because in my country, they are male-dominated. Through these visits, I was able to respond to thousands of questions from girls, like how did I manage to study science? Is it hard? What are the challenges, etc. So in general, these events have inspired and ignited science passion to most girls, and they can now walk with confidence that it is possible for a girl to be a scientist. Also, during the school visits, I ask girls about women scientists they know in my country, Africa, or globally. Unfortunately, very few could mention names of women scientists, meaning that their work are not seen by this younger generation. And here we are talking about Gen Z, who spend a lot of time on social media platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. So we could take advantage of these social media platforms to promote STEM, like our presence on social media is very important if we want to inspire a young generation. Also, people think science is hard, boring, it's for nerds, unlike other careers where you see people traveling the world, have a social life. So I realized that it is very important for us scientists to lead by example. And for example, if you check my Instagram account, I have about 49K followers, and most of them are these young people. So I always try to share both my work and social life in order to show them it is possible to do both. I also noticed that it is important to include boys during sensitization events. This is because if you include girls, it is very easier for them to be discouraged and demoralized by boys. But if you include boys as well, they understand that it is important for them to support girls to study science rather than neutralize what have been discussed in the session. Therefore, I have noticed an increased number of girls in science for schools which we combine girls and boys during sensitization events as compared with schools which we sensitize only girls. So in summary, this is my experience in promoting female education, particularly STEM in Tanzania. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neema, for this very interesting presentation, and I'm sure you're going to have many questions, and I really like the last point about, because it's really inclusiveness, so you don't talk only to women, they are your target, but if you don't change the mindset of boys, you will not achieve the same results. Father Harold, tell us a little bit about your little institution. Your small institution that is young but still has outreach throughout Colombia.
Thank you. Muy buenos días.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jamil, for the invitation, and thank you for allowing me to share the experiences of all the people on this panel. We're talking about education, equity, equality, and the major issue that is really of concern for all of us who would like education to be a sustainable pathway for all humans for development, to allow individuals to transform their lives and transform society. It has not been easy in some of our cultures to ensure this, but I'd like to talk to you about Uniminuto in Colombia, an institution that has been up and running for 30 years in Colombia in the framework of an approach to access in Colombia, which at present is about 51% nationally. Uniminuto provides 4.5% of the total amount of graduated students. We have over 100,000 students, and the mission is to provide higher education, quality higher education that is relevant and that supports the basis of the social pyramid, that gives access to those who've never had access to higher education before. It is known as the most public private university in Colombia. It is available nationwide, and the main idea is to ensure that education can provide solutions for social and economic issues throughout the country. The national system is present in about 60 different locations in Colombia. It's a nationwide system that has a very regional impact, that is located in those places where higher education had been non-existent. Higher education in Colombia is concentrated in a few major cities, in Bogotá, the capital, in Medellín, Barranquilla, Cali, but it is not easy to access higher education, even though there have been public policies to try to improve access for other regions. But it has not been easy, and we have taken that option to move into those locations and to train talent directly on the spot on the basis of our offer. Now, our population, and this is probably part of our target group, the basis of the pyramid, there's a sociological approach with different strata in society, strata 1, 2, 3, the people who really have not had access to higher education for economic reasons. And we have developed strategies to do this in terms of funding. We have set up a system to provide subsidies to our students with scholarships. We also have a provision of services, educational credit, to ensure that students can have access interest-free. And we have sometimes we have people who fall behind in their payments, but they always catch up. And the thing is, we have a high rate of women students. We perhaps have the highest in Colombia because women have been able to access education locally in their territories, in their regions. And 70% of our students are actually women. And we're very proud of this because we are providing that mission. And the idea is also to train women in sciences. We have a STEM program, engineering faculty, and scientific and technological innovation. So science is also one of our main focuses, also depending on the actual needs of the local territories and regions where we are present. And with this model, we provide also ownership of technologies. We are a university that over the past 15 to 20 years have started to integrate technology into our educational processes with distance learning. And this has led to our expansion and has enabled us to settle in different regions and with the support of virtual approaches. And we have the 3 modalities today. And this is perhaps why our model from the didactic and pedagogical point of view is very flexible. And we have, for instance, dual curricula, and we also develop a variety of curricula for those who have never had access to higher education before. So the regionalization, the funding, educational credit, flexibility in curricula, all of this is aimed to assist students and to ensure that they can succeed. We attract them into the system, and once they are in the system, we do our utmost to ensure that they remain in the system and that they achieve success in terms of obtaining a degree, because the final aim is success for students and graduation. And we've set up mechanisms to provide support for students. And we use technology a good deal, and we're integrating artificial intelligence today. The aim is to try to have some forecasts of the student and the curricula. We use as many platforms as possible to provide support to the student without being paternalistic, but to ensure that the student has all possible conditions to succeed in their studies, and also in terms of employability afterwards, because we also had to integrate some strategies for entrepreneurship and employability to ensure that this could integrate the students in networks. So that the student, once they have graduated, are capable of integrating either the labour market or entrepreneurship, because what we would really like to do is also to ensure that they can be autonomous and set up their own company. And not everybody is cut out for it, but we do our utmost to assist those who are. Now, as you were saying, as you can see this presentation, and which I've been trying to explain, we also have a research approach. So we looked at the entire educational project. Obviously, we teach. We also carry out research, applied research. We have our own scientific and innovation approach that is regionally based. And we've done this in the framework of the public policies of our nation for those territories that come under the Plan for Territorial Development. And those that have not had institutional capacities. And we are now present in those territories to provide and generate knowledge within the communities. So this is why we look to social innovation. We wish to build knowledge with the communities in which we are present in those territories with a regional agenda. And we have a series of programs that bring the communities on board, including in research. And we use our own students to seed innovation and to move forward together and find solutions to the needs of those territories. And so we integrate the academic context in terms of entrepreneurship, governance, private enterprise, and the academic world. And everyone has to contribute. So we try to find solutions, including through social technology, with social innovation pathways, to understand, analyze, create, implement, package, and scale up. And these are the pathways that we've developed over time through social and scientific innovation. And we also have an interconnection between teaching and social innovation. Research is not only to improve academic processes within our own teaching exercises, but also we look to having a social impact. Otherwise, at least this is my personal opinion, it wouldn't be much point. There wouldn't be much point. And so these are a few of our figures in terms of scientific impact over the past few years. This is the jewel in the crown of our institution, and it has enabled us to be very much present locally and to provide higher education in Colombia at a regional level. And now let's look to the pandemic, and just giving this as an example of the program. With the pandemic, we needed to support informal workers, micro-enterprises, and all those that had suddenly stopped their activities due to the pandemic, and also the connection between the student, the teacher, and the realities and needs of our local communities. This program was really welcomed by the national government, and it has enabled us to also help informal and micro enterprises to recover, and all this within a curriculum that is flexible, and we remain flexible. I insist on that point, because I do not believe that we can provide education in the most needy conditions without giving all the institutions capacities to that task. Now, in Colombia, I think we are now highly recognized. Out of the 298 institutions of higher education in our country, and also we provide all of this with a level of quality, relevance, quality, equity. And all of this always with quality. Just because you're providing something for the most vulnerable doesn't mean it should be lower quality. We want to do this and do it properly, and every day we demand the best with a model of partnerships. Of course, we couldn't do this alone. And in the context of partnerships, we try to provide a response to the needs of our country. This is the model that we are proud of, and I'm certain that Colombia really welcomes our approach.
Father Harold, for this impressive project, sharing that with us. And now we move back to Australia with Nadine, and who is going to tell us why Australia is a champion, but what is still missing in terms of fulfilling this equity agenda. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamil, and thank you to all the panelists and to you in the room. If I was in Australia, I would start with an acknowledgement of country, which in my case would acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work. So instead, I would like to recognise all Indigenous people in colonised countries who are participating in the conference today, both in the room and online. And in the case of the Australian Indigenous people, would like to recognise that the lands were never ceded. With that, I will tell you a little bit about the Australian case study, as Jamil has said, and really look back over the last 13 years of what we've done. So Australia has a very long-standing commitment to equity policy and higher education, which goes back to 1990, and a policy white paper which is called A Fair Chance for All. I'm going to do that at the macro, the meso, and the micro level. So Veronica has very much talked to the macro level. Father Harold has talked to the meso level or the institutional level, and Nima has shared with us an initiative at the micro level. So I'm trying to pull this together for the Australian case. And I'm going to do that at the highest level because I need to cover so much ground. So I'm going to give you the overview and then invite you to ask me any questions, you know, like if I've glossed over anything or you'd like to follow up with anything. So in terms of the Australian higher education sector, there's 37 public universities, there's a handful of private ones, and then there's a large cluster of non-university higher education providers. There's also a very sizable vocational education and training sector. There's 1 million students in the system. Prior to COVID, 25% of them were international students. Higher education used to be the third biggest export good of Australia, right behind iron ore and coal, which gives you, you know, like a sense of the status of higher education in Australia. You wouldn't be surprised that, you know, with COVID-19 and the border closures, that had a very large impact on the higher education sector in Australia, but that is a different story that I'm not going to tell you today. So if we look at the macro level and what we've done in the higher education policy space, I'll take you back to 2010 when Julia Gillard, who eventually became Prime Minister, was Education Minister, and she introduced two main reforms that hung off two interrelated targets. So the target of the Labour government at the time was to have 40% of young people completing an undergraduate degree and 20% of the enrolled student population to be from what we call low socioeconomic status backgrounds. So in Australia, the Australian Census categorises the lowest 25% of households as from lower CS backgrounds, and so the target was that we would not quite reach parity, but that we'd shoot for 20% of participation, and they became known as the 40-20 targets. There were two big reforms that were implemented to achieve that target, and the sort of the more expensive and in many ways the more impactful policy reform was what we call demand-driven funding. So that meant that universities could enroll as many students as they could attract, and the government would fund them for them. So you know, and Jamil has spoken to that quite often during the conference, Australia has an income contingent loan system that was set up by Bruce Chapman many years ago. Students now pay 50% of their own fees, and the government contributes the other 50% of the fees, and there's like a low repayment system. So demand-driven funding was hugely important, and it expanded the sector massively. So between 2010 and today, there's about a 20% increase in the total sector. The other thing that Gillard introduced was what we call the Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program, or HEP, with 3 Ps. The focus was on students from lower CS backgrounds, and the money was given to universities to work with schools and communities, lower CS communities and disadvantaged schools, as well as support their current students towards completion of undergraduate degrees. That program has been running for 13 years. It has attracted more than $1.5 billion of funding. So it is a sizable, significant long-term investment into the sector. I'm not going to go through all of the different policy reforms that have happened in between, and there were a few of them. So what I'm going to do instead is quickly share with you what we have achieved. So we saw for the first time in Australia, apologies, I didn't say that, Australia has a 30-year time series, a data series that goes back for 30 years so that we can track progress over time. And what we found is that we reached something my colleague Andrew Harvey called peak equity. So at the highest point of participation, 17% of undergraduate domestic students were from a low SES background, and that was the first increase we had seen ever since we started keeping records. In terms of the raw numbers, what that means is that we have 20% more students in the system than we had in 2013. So the particular time series I'm using starts in 2013. I won't go into the reasons. It's got to do with statistics and comparing apples with apples. So at the moment we have about 130,000 students from lower CS backgrounds enrolled in a higher education degree. There's other stories in there that might be of interest to you. Students with disability have seen a 60% increase. Indigenous students have seen a 50% increase, over the past 8 years, which is really impressive. And since then, we have seen a decline, and we can talk about why that is, and it's got to do with recent policy changes. So if that's the macro level, that's the policy level. If we go to the meso level, the institutional level, the picture is a little bit more varied. So what the high level observation is that some institutions have done a much more heavy lifting and have contributed much more to the achievement of the targets and the increase in participation rates, while others have gone backwards. So despite the funding, despite the money that universities got, some of them have gone backwards in terms of the representation. So what we can say, I did a big piece of research in 2015, and I've been back in the data to see if the trends have changed, but they hold. So what we can see is there is not a lot of correlation between the outcomes in terms of increasing the participation of equity group students at a university and the amount of money that it received, the amount of growth that it had, or the size and diversity of its undergraduate cohort. So you would have expected that universities that are already very diverse and already support a lot of diverse cohorts would see huge increases, would continue to grow, and some have, but others have gone backwards. And similarly with elite institutions, some of them have really lifted and risen to the cause, and others have gone backward. So there aren't any clear pictures, and there's no real patterns across the sector in terms of outcome. Of course, we have to look at demand-driven funding, and there are authors that have argued that demand-driven funding had a much bigger impact than the equity funding that was put into the sector. And at sector level, that is true. Definitely, like the access issues to particularly elite institutions were solved to some extent by the fact that institutions could enroll as many students as they could attract. That worked around quota systems, that worked around the tests, it gave a lot of leeway to institutions to enroll students they wouldn't have ordinarily. But demand-driven funding does not overcome the barriers that we have talked about so often, and you have, Jamil, around motivation, around academic preparation, around role modeling, around, do I see myself as a person who can do university or who can do STEM, right? So that is the work that has been addressed by equity money and by equity practitioners like myself. Neither policy has addressed the most important barrier to access comprehensively, and that is attainment at school level, at secondary school level. So Australia has one of the most inequitable school systems in the world, which might surprise you. That is, the private-public divide is not unique to developing countries. That is also very real in Australia. And then in 2022, because we have more data now, there's some really interesting differences at the state level. So Australia is a federated system, and there's some really interesting observations as to how the different states have responded to the equity funding, and we need to explore that further. So finally, at the micro level, at the activity level, and that is the whole conversations around what works and what doesn't work. Again, we have been really privileged that the federal government set up a National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, and I encourage you to Google this and to find really their wealth of resources. So they have commissioned and funded research over the past 8 years. There is a wealth of research studies available, and you can really sort of dip in and have a look by equity group. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource. So again, a snippet of what we know. In terms of increasing applications to university, we know that highly engaged outreach work that is undertaken in partnership between schools and universities work. I was part of a study that showed a statistically significant difference in applications to universities in highly engaged schools. What do I mean when I say highly engaged equity programs? They are programs where most of the cohort in any particular year level participates, where we're not picking out individual students, but where the whole class participates, where they are participating across most year levels of their secondary schooling, and where they participate in both on-campus and in-school activities. So these are multi-year partnerships between universities and schools. Often the same personnel is involved in the university, in the school. The school knows how to expect the university to come in. It's built into their curriculum. The programs are curriculum aligned. That makes a difference because we argued it creates a virtuous spiral of aspirations for higher education. What doesn't work in Australia is regional and remote outreach. We just haven't cracked the model yet. Regional and remote outreach is incredibly expensive, and it's not in the best interest, in the best financial interest of a university to do it. So we really haven't cracked that one yet. Increasing access, if you're interested in that, many universities in Australia run enabling programs, which are programs for students who have been out of formal education for a long time or who didn't get the grades, and enabling programs really work as an access pathway. Some universities take up to 20%, so the University of Newcastle, for example, takes 20% of their commencing cohort from an enabling program. The University of South Australia has similar stats. So if you're interested in this, talk to me after the session. In terms of increasing retention, we know that scholarships work, both equity scholarships and equity merit scholarships. I've been trying to get a project up that shows that money plus support is the best offer, because it's not just the monetary effect, but it's also, you know, the socialization, the building community when students get into university. Also on retention, we know that Indigenous specific work through dedicated units really works. In terms of increasing success rates, pass rates, there's interesting experiments with pedagogy at Victoria University that have implemented a block model, which means that they still teach 4 subjects per semester, but they teach them sequentially. So students only do 1 at a time, and they do them very intensively. And we have found that that creates really good success rates. What does not work? General service provision. So, you know, like build it and they come, offer general services and expect equity students to come. They do not. So we find if we do that, we have lower usage rates by the target group students. There's less help-seeking behavior. There's less of a sense of entitlement of help. And so if you just offer it generally to everybody, equity group students tend not to take it up. So, you know, like this was the really high level overview. In terms of core learnings, there's really complex interrelationships between government policy and how that gets interpreted at the institutional level. Leadership makes a huge difference, you know, like in the institutions, and I think Father Harold, you have really spoken to that, you know, what a difference leadership makes. The impact of the HEP program needs to account for demand-driven funding, which has since sort of been disestablished. And the next steps for the What Works program is really a synthesis and a meta-analysis of the really great research that we have done and package this up for really great instruction, sort of almost a how-to tool set for both practitioners in universities as well as policymakers in Canberra and elsewhere, so that we can all learn from what has happened in Australia over the past 13 years.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for this overview of a very short time of a very long and very wide set of measures. You just mentioned leadership. I remember the first time I visited Uniminuto being struck because they had a dedicated vice president for the first year of study. Because as in many institutions, which I have observed also elsewhere, is that what happens or doesn't happen the first year is the most important dimension for retention. I'm sure you have lots of questions and comments, so the floor is yours. Yes, please. We need a microphone for the interpreters, please. Necesitamos el micrófono para los intérpretes.
Policy Research and Governance. My question is about the feedback mechanism. You are talking about how you incorporate more people in higher education system. So first thing, how you have formulated a policy, and in the process, how you have involved more people, in the policy making process, and when you have implemented the policy, what is your feedback mechanism to improve and to include more people or to make it better?
Yeah, is that at the government level?
Yeah, at the government.
Yeah. So what preceded the changes in 2010 was the Bradley Review of Higher Education. So there was a panel of ex-vice chancellors and scholars in the field led by Emeritus Professor Denise Bradley. They did like an 18-month review of the higher education sector and made a set of recommendations to the government at the time, which was Kevin Rudd's Labor government. And the government took these recommendations and really implemented most of them. So the Bradley Review was incredibly important, and that formed the basis for the higher education reforms that got implemented. So it was an evidence-based process led by experts in the sector. And then you said, so how did we bring more people in? I guess, like the panel went out and they did consultations and they talked to the vice chancellors, they would have talked to researchers in the field. They collected lots of data, so they worked with the Department of Education and Training at the time, collected a lot of data about, participation rates and so on. They did projections and modelling of the costs of the different options that the government had available, and they came up with a set of recommendations that got endorsed by and large by the government at the time.
But if you allow me, I think this question is equally important, this issue of monitoring, evaluation, and adjustment. So maybe we could, 1 minute each of name, how do you know what's working well with your program and what you need to make adjustment for? And then I will ask Veronica and Father Harold.
Okay, thank you very much. So for my case, in Bakishule initiative, most of the time we keep on monitoring in order to ensure that there is an increased number of the girls in science, because that is our target. So in all the schools that we have been visited, we keep on making a follow-up, because once we do this, the sensitization events and different activities on the project, we interact with maybe Form 2 students who are going to Form 3, where they are going to select if they want to go for science or not. So most of the time we keep on going back to those schools while they're in Form 3 in order to evaluate how many girls have opted for the science subjects, and then from there we can measure the success of what we have done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Veronica.
Sí.
And your government is so predicated on the need to involve more people. So what kind of mechanism are you planning to put in place?
Bueno, nosotros estamos...
That's right. We as a government, for us it's very clear that if we want to speak of inclusion in higher education, we need to set up mechanisms for dialogue that leave the academic sphere, that needs to have a triple dimension, a focus on gender, plurinationality, and working together with the territories. So the policies around admission to higher education, well, what we're trying to do is, first of all, look at what information we've got, disaggregate it, and of course, this information has to be built up. There's a lot of data that actually has not been examined properly. There's a lot of data as well about what universities are doing that hasn't been analyzed properly yet. There are specific perspectives, for example, those of indigenous peoples that are not always taken into account. For each of the decisions to be taken, we're trying to make sure that, first of all, we're in the territories and carry out a bottom-up or grassroots-based project. What we think or what we've seen is that a great number of the discrepancies or lacks or the lack of equality that we have are due to public policies that have not only been taken from a neoliberal ideological perspective, which has been very decisive in the way in which people think about higher education in Chile, but beyond that, they've been taken from one perspective, the Western perspective. And that perspective doesn't take into account the beneficiary, those who are the subjects of public policies, who are to be understood, need to be understood as actors. So we have to work on the territories with gender and with diversity. And that's something that we're beginning to do to try to come up with better financing mechanisms, just to give an example. If we want to come up with systems for funding or financing higher education, that can only be done if we understand that it's women who have the greatest amount of debt, or the native people who are the most poor, or the difficulty in finding job that people with disabilities have. So we think that what needs to be changed is the way that we focus on certain aspects, and that's what we're doing with our public policy.
Yo creo que en
I think that in our institution we've had two different ways of trying to get the internal, in-house academic community as well as everyone around us involved. What's most important, in my opinion, is to recognize or to see ourselves within the context of the territories, getting involved with the communities that we interact with, and to make it clear that we can't do this alone. There's permanent interaction with the sectors, with governments, with business, with society, and that's part of a social, innovative focus thanks to which we will be able to make sure that the community is involved in the educational project. When we get to a particular place in our development plan, we don't say we're going to go to that place, but rather this is something that evolves from a specific dialogue that is held taking into account the needs of the context with the reality of that context, getting all sectors involved to facilitate that program, to make sure that everyone are connected amongst themselves, involved with the project, that can help in the best way possible to make sure that we're successful. And from an in-house perspective, and the issue of leadership, in my opinion, the academic community must be greatly involved in the proposals in the project, professors, students, and more. The issue of welfare for students that we've talked about, but is even more important today than in the past, in this model that's been built up and structured, always take into account the various variabilities that could affect a student, financial, psychological, economic, etc., etc. All of these different aspects that impact students. And if any one of those elements were not working properly, well, then we wouldn't have the impact, we wouldn't have the success that we're hoping to have in offering high value, in offering possibility for transformation of individuals and of society. So within our institution, these are these mechanisms we tried to build up with a professor working on specific issues who in their department are connected with student issues. When we see that there's issues, or when we do analysis about dropout or lack of academic success in general, well, perhaps there's a problem with digital access to internet. Now, during the pandemic, for example, we realized how many needs students actually had, things that they would need if they wanted academic success. And we're hoping to be able to offer that via our projects. Externally, participation of the community and different stakeholders is important, but in-house, well, all of us who are involved in the project need to contribute to make sure it's successful.
Now, I have two ladies on the left, and then I'll come to the right. Or maybe I'll take three questions. Okay. Yes, please.
Bueno, mi nombre es Sani Romero.
I'm Sani Romero. I'm from Paraguay. First of all, I'd like to thank you, or I would like to commend these empowered women that I see on the table here today. Visibility is important, and I would like to commend as well the men who are here as well to make sure that we can all create a better and more just world. There's a lot of us who are fighting for the same goals. Then I would also like to commend this process that's going on between secondary education and higher education. Trying to consolidate a higher education level means having to work in a coordinated way with other systems from the beginning, as we've heard people mention here. I would like to ask our Australian representative, when you talk about committed programs, specifically with the secondary education level, could you talk to us about some specific programs, details, to understand the way actually that work functions? Thank you.
Nadine, I'm going to take three questions if you don't mind, and then we can. Yes, please, in yellow, lady in yellow.
My apologies for not standing. My name is Lacey Barnes. I am from the United States American Federation of Teachers. We represent educators at all levels. I have two questions, one for Nadine. Thank you. One for Nadine and the other for the panel. What are your working theories as to the differences between the universities who have gone backwards with the funding to create diversity inclusion and those who have gone forward and were successful? I would be curious to know what are your thoughts there. The second question that I have is around the student debt. A couple of folks have mentioned debt. We in America AFT have been fighting significantly and advocating for students who are mostly students of color, who have engaged both public and private, specifically more so private institutions, and significant debts that will follow them for the rest of their lives. We, as you all probably know, have had interesting administrations that have not fought for our students on that front. So it has left groups like AFT fighting to get student debt reduced, wiped out. Organizations have fought to get students engaged in programs that relieve their debt. I'm curious to know if there are any individual or group efforts that are engaging that type of activity as well. Thank you.
And the last one on my right here, please.
Hi, I'm Justine Sass. I work at UNESCO. I lead our work on education for inclusion and gender equality. Fantastic session. It was super interesting, and I congratulate all of the speakers. I have a million questions, but I'll stick with two if I may. Nima, your program is really inspirational, and there was a point that was made that we need to change the mindset of boys to get more girls into STEM. We also need to change the mindset of girls and the mindset of teachers, and I'm wondering, there's still a lot of unconscious bias. There's still materials in the classroom that include gender bias in different interactions with girls and boys, etc. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what your program is doing to address it. And my second question is on the inclusion of boys, because we don't often talk about what do we need to do to be getting boys into education and higher education. We did a report last month at UNESCO looking at boys' disengagement from education. We now have more boys globally out of school than we have girls. Boys are more likely than girls to repeat grades, have lower learning outcomes in reading, increasingly in maths and science. There are much fewer representation of boys globally in higher education, and it's actually the case across all regions except for sub-Saharan Africa. I'm wondering if you can speak to what are you doing to also look at boys' engagement in education, whether it be perhaps in Latin America where we see quite significant gaps, but if any of the speakers want to respond, I'd be very interested. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we're going to ask Nadine to start, and then Neymar, and maybe you, Veronica, want to say something about student debt and further error. If I may add a follow-up question for you, Neymar, is that I was wondering, as your program gets more successful and gets visibility, I know you have received international visibility. How about in Tanzania? And have university reached out to you to say, oh, we want to work with you to reach out to these girls? Nadine.
I'm going to respond to the school partnership question first, and I'm going to roll in the boys into my response. So what we did with school-university partnerships is really at the core of the HEP funding. So when we started, it had dedicated partnership funding that gave a proportion of the money to universities to partner with secondary schools in some of the most disadvantaged areas, and there are some amazing success stories from that. I'm happy to give you my card and give you a few publications, that really sort of chart that partnership work, and it took the universities, to approach the schools, as equals to say, what can we do here to really work with the school leadership team to change culture, to change expectations, to change practices in many ways, to change the conversation, really. And we had amazing success stories. So I worked for my fellowship with a school in Western Sydney who had, for the first time since the school existed, a student articulate to university, right? The first time ever. And so there are stories like that. What I should say is there were 3 policy reforms that Gillard launched. So it was demand-driven funding, dedicated equity funding, and the Gonski funding school reform, which gave money to schools based on a funding standard, so that students were compensated for the level of disadvantage that they experienced in their student cohort. And that gave free money or free floating money, not tied money, to schools that they could use for the partnership activities. And that made a huge difference in many of the schools, right? Because for the first time, they had money that they could deploy where they thought it would make most of a difference. It wasn't tied to a particular purpose. Like, they didn't have to employ more teachers or create more resources or buy more tech. They could actually do what they thought was most useful for the school. So we've published on this. There's some really good practice models, mainly in partnership. So universities got together and worked in partnership in their geographic area. And that can be, so we had a consortium in the Sydney Basin, so it really captured Greater Sydney. We had a big consortium in Queensland, which is one of the biggest states in Australia, which carved up the state and said, you go here, I go here, I go here, but we all run similar initiatives, you know, across the state, and we compare notes and we learn from each other. So there's different models of what was done in Australia, and some helpful learnings. In terms of boys, so one of the things that we ran up against really early is that people would say, oh, well, we give you the well-behaved students, which are usually girls, right, who are often on sort of at least thinking about university already. And we kept saying, no, give us the next tranche. Give us the boys, give us the ones who are not yet on the journey, you know, who are not yet thinking about it. But that was a real conversation with the school, sort of to run up against their expectations, to say, don't give us the don't give us the kids that are already on the journey, right? Give us the next level, or give us all of them, right? Don't exclude particular kids because you think they'll cause trouble, right? So give them to us and we'll deal with it, and, you know, we'll return them to you safely. So I think that there was, we also had the, you know, what are you doing here as a university, right? So you'd rock up in your university t-shirt to a very disadvantaged neighborhood and they go, what are you doing here, right? Our kids are not university kids. And so we had to do a lot of that resetting expectations. And what we have really found is if you approach these communities with high expectations, right? High expectations for their students of what they can achieve and what we are here to talk to them about, invariably they lift, right? So I think what I've really, and it hurts, right? That there's so many low expectations in schools that, you know, like the kids absorb by virtue of being in the schools. And again, leadership makes a huge difference, yeah. One quick response to your question around, you know, what was going on. So I hypothesized in my fellowship, well, I looked at 3 case studies. And so what I hypothesized for them was that there were 3 different reasons why they really got involved in the game, and why they, you know, like how they interpreted the national policy in their institutional context. In one institution, the equity cohort was really important for institutional growth. So the university wanted to grow, and the low SES community was core to their growth ambitions, and that took off. In another one, they really wanted to diversify. It was an elite institution. It was a group of 8 institution. And they really wanted to diversify. And so they built this into everything, into their outreach, into their selection, into their transition programs, into the way they changed their whole delivery model. And they built diversity, greater diversity into that, and that worked. And the third university tried to run a social justice argument. And unfortunately, that was the weakest outcome of all. So it was a philosophical commitment that ran sort of against what the rest of the institution was doing. And so as soon as the champion left, it collapsed. Yeah. So that's the best I can say on that.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Nima.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so for my case, I'll just talk about Bakishule, this initiative. At the time when we started this initiative, our goal was just to increase the number of girls in science. At that moment, we didn't understand what are the reasons there are fewer girls in science. So once we interacted with students, we then realized that many of the reasons including gender bias, which touches both teachers and the community. And there are other issues like the issue of perception of the community towards women in science. Thereafter, we started to include other programs related only to teachers, and we dedicated other programs related to community. When you talk about community, I just emphasize on the parents. So in this Bakishule initiative, we have special program for students whereby our goals is to encourage and to give them self-confidence that they can do science through sensitization events and different activities that we organize with them. But also we have another programs with teachers to talk with them about the issue of gender bias, because we all know that teachers are the one who interact with students all the time. And you can find sometimes teachers are the one who discourage even students to study science. So we have observed that there is an increased number of students in science after increasing these programs which we interacted direct with the teachers in a classroom. And also the issue of community, talking about the parents, how parents, they talk with their child about science. Because we realized other parents, they always discourage their children, like, you cannot do science, you cannot perform well. Your brother will be good in this part and not yours. So once we started talking with parents, we also realized that there is an increased number of the people, especially girls, who opted to study science. And the other thing which is very interesting, which I talk about, the issue of including boys, it is true that once we started this program, we didn't think anything about boys in the beginning, because our target was just to include girls and to increase the number of girls. And then we come to realize that if we just focus on girls, we just talk with them, and then after the end of the session, they go back to meet with boys in the classroom. And then boys started to demoralize and even discourage what have been discussed. But once we combine those students together, boys and girls, we have seen an increased number of girls in science. Means that boys have a big ability to support girls to study science. And I think this is something which is new, especially in Tanzania, and I've started to share with some of the people, especially other people who are promoting STEM in my country, that we are supposed not only to focus on girls, because we are not supposed to left boys behind. Boys will be there to support girls to achieve what they want to do, especially in supporting or in opting to study science. So I think those are the things which I wanted to highlight. And back to you. You asked me about if other institutions or the government have been interested for this project. Yes, there are different schools, including public and private schools, who have been interested for Bakishule to come and visit their schools. But so far we have been able to interact with about 31 schools in Tanzania. But we all know that the issue of there are some challenges. Me as an academic, I have to balance both my work and this initiative at the same time. So it is not that easier for me to visit all schools across Tanzania, but I've been able to reach some of the schools, and I'm working hard to reach more schools. But also, as I've been saying, that I have observed the power of social media when you want to interact with this young generation. So most of the time we're using my social media accounts. I'm active in all accounts in order to meet with more girls and more boys and encourage even them boys to support girls to study science. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nema. Before I give the floor to Veronica and Father Harold, I know I may be fired as a moderator, but I just for 1 minute mention an experiment in Colombia. I think that speaks to what you just mentioned. It's, Colombia and many Latin American countries are very macho countries. So this initiative is called Football, Soccer with a Heart. And the principle is that it's to encourage girls to play soccer. That is not seen only as a male activity. And this program, they have mixed gender teams. So you have boys and girls playing together. And there are two rules that have really transformed the panorama. One is that the referee, there is no referee. The teams have to be referees, so they have to reach consensus in a society that has been plagued by civil war and where reaching consensus and dialogue is very difficult. And the second rule is that the first goal has to be scored by a girl. So if it's scored by a boy, it's not. So the team together, boys and girls, have a strong incentive to make sure that the girls are just not part of the team, but then it's only the boys with the ball. It's a fascinating program. Sorry to get out of my role,
Nice.
but I think it's an interesting example. We are almost running out of time, so I'm going to give 2 minutes to Veronica and to Father Harold to address the question, but then perhaps to say your last few wise words, and then I'll give 1 minute back to Nadine and Neema. Veronica.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. For us, what's important is to understand that education is it's there in order to engage in social and political transformation. So when we try and conceive a more fair society, one without discrimination, one which defends human rights, one which embraces diversity, well, then it's those structures that need to be transformed. So the political decision is not how to reduce gaps, but how to change structural conditions that have meant that societies define themselves in a particular way, that have meant that there's certain reference points that limit the decisions taken within universities. When we say, or when we are surprised in Chile that we've had, for the very first time, female in charge of a university in the 21st century, when we're still surprised to have a female prime minister or president, when we're surprised to finally find ourselves that someone is occupying a position of power who comes from the native communities or who has a diversity. So when we talk about a society which is equal, we talk about a society that should not be surprised when such things happen. And higher education will be key to making sure this happens. Understanding education as a continuum, of course, but higher education is essential when what we're trying to do is make sure that in the classrooms, in academic spaces, amongst teachers, we have people that can work in sciences, technology, innovation, and knowledge, and help us focus towards creating that society we want to reach. So this goes from specific guidelines or instructions given, but also goes to the way we work on a day-to-day level. When I was a girl, in the classes in history, they talked about the conquering of the indigenous peoples, about how poor and ignorant we were. And I was ashamed of my people, and I tried to disappear. And I hoped that the teacher would never even mention my name, or would say my name, a Mapuche name that they would pronounce incorrectly. It wasn't until I got into higher education that I could finally hear about and read and learn about, actually go into the field and start to question this Western way of thinking that I had been given throughout all of my life. And this happened with the day-to-day work that I had with the teachers as well, that with whom I helped to understand the way that I was exposed to discrimination on a daily level, that we internalize to such an extent that we don't even question it. So the transformation that my government is trying to engage in when we say that we have this feminist approach, well, we're not talking about setting up a system where it's men against women, but rather understanding that there's a way to organize society which can be different, which is not based on competition, that's not based on individualism, that's based on collaboration, on equality that doesn't surprise us, on making sure that in the spaces of power, bodies and languages and colors and shapes are present that have not been in those spaces of power previously. And that's a key for societal transformation. Higher education, if it's not working in creating that kind of project, then we're just going to keep reproducing the same structural weaknesses and structural lacks and deficiencies that we've had up until now. So the chance to be able to talk about these things right here in these spaces, which UNESCO is offering us, is how we help define a society that is not only inclusive, because, of course, we could start asking, what do we mean by inclusive? Including the same people that are already there, but we're talking about complete transformation, where we won't even need to question about who we're including and incorporating anymore. That's the challenge we want to reach for society, to teach citizens like that. That's our challenge as a government. That is not something we're going to be able to do in 4 years. We've got a lot to do in Chile. But we do want to at least lay the foundation for such transformation which will lead to future structural change, paradigm change. That's what we're hoping for. Thank you very much, Veronica.
I completely agree with what has just been said by a representative from Chile. And I'm thinking about an author that you have probably read, Mathiesen, who has stated that the greatest opportunity given to anyone in their life is to extend their freedom, to empower their freedom. And I think that that is equity. It is opportunity. What is it that we do? How do we structure it? How do we implement it to ensure that those opportunities are accessible to all? And as I like to say, that the road is flat, and we're talking about football earlier. The football pitch has to be flat so that we're all running on an equal footing. And so what approach do we adopt? What is the paradigm to ensure that our mechanisms are mechanisms of opportunity for all? This is the effort that we are making from a variety of points of view. And I was talking about funding earlier. This is, I believe, something that should really that we should really focus on to ensure that we give opportunity to building equity. We in Colombia have a whole funding system that has been very much inspired by Australia and pay on the basis of income, and to ensure that the students do not end up, and this is part of the responsibility of public policies and institutions in the context of building up a service for education in a way that we can all provide the best service we can, be it private or public. How do we ensure that we achieve this? I think that this is our major challenge, to ensure that our students are not put in even more difficult circumstances that they already are. So I'll be finishing with this, Jamil. Bogota, in terms of public policy, the mayor has opened up a new program of young people to university to create the link between secondary education and higher education to ensure that in grade 9, 10, 11, young people can be part of that program to open up, to be flexible. These courses, of course, have to be assimilated. They have to be validated for the purpose of accessing university, because naturally young people have to have their prior training. They can't start from scratch. And I was also part of a STEM program for women to ensure that girls are given greater support, and our own scientific platform is providing training and skills, and in robotics in particular, and other scientific fields that are particularly focused on women. So I think there are a number of programs in the world, and I hope that the ones we have in Colombia can also help. Thank you.
A very quick question, Professor Cordano. Please.
I know that it's late, but I did have a question, because I'm just so very curious about the approaches you've taken to language differences. I know you've talked about indigenous peoples. You've talked as well about the cultures in your respective countries that have long disregarded other cultures and individuals. And I wonder if that's true for people who speak different languages. Are there dominant languages that are used in your universities? And how do you address that question or that challenge of different languages? Because I think misunderstandings often begin as the source is the language that's being used. I know you talked a lot about, well, all of you have talked about the language challenges that you face in your country. So I'm curious, how do you think about languages as part of access or preventing access?
Neema, you have 1 minute to respond. Anything you want to respond or to leave a last message with us, including this last question, and then Nadine, and then we'll see.
The language. Okay.
Or the other previous question. You don't have to answer this question of language. And we could ask Veronica and Father Harold.
Quiero responder con
I simply wanted to respond by giving one example from my university. In my university, we have people who are deaf, mute, who have different abilities, because everybody has abilities. And the rector said, well, second language is English, and these young people who were deaf and mute, they said, but why should we now learn a second language when we actually already have a second language? So we really had to understand that this was also a language, a form of expression, and that they were entitled to demand the right to express themselves in their own language, and that we have young people in our university that arrive with different abilities, and we have to value that and include them. Thank you.
Okay, to wrap up, the issue of equality and pluralism is very important in the creation of an inclusive society. The benefits of including, for example, women in STEM are many. However, the government, other organizations, and each and every one of us has a big role to play in ensuring that equality, inclusion, and pluralism are attained in our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nadine, any of the issues?
Yeah, a quickest response to the question. Australia is very clear that, you know, English is the language of instruction, and adjustments are made, but it's, you know, like that is really the line that is taken by most of the universities, or all of that I'm aware of. In terms of, you know, like a take-home message, Veronica, I'm so inspired by your approach, the approach of your government, and I can't wait to see what you can achieve. And I wish you all the best for your feminist approach to public policy. Truly inspirational. For the Australian case, and sort of more broadly, what I'm taking home from this conference is, yes, context matters, right? Context matters at the country level, context matters at the institutional level, and context matters at the individual level. But that doesn't mean we have to reinvent the wheel all over. We have so much expertise, you know, like not just in my country, but, you know, like really across the global community. And our challenge now is to pool it, to synthesize it, to put the arguments in front of decision makers so that, you know, as Arturo said in an earlier panel, ignorance is no defense anymore. And we have to make the argument, but we also have to provide the solutions. And they exist. We just have to share them. We have to adapt them to our own context. And that will, you know, like, that will help us shift the needle on what we are doing. So we don't have to start from scratch. This is not a greenfield site. You know, let's learn from each other and let's share what we know and then apply it in our context to make a difference.
We've run out of time. Thank you for participating actively. I want to thank really my 4 panelists, Nadine, Neema, Veronica, and Father Harold. I think I will not try to synthesize, but it just proved the value of hearing about other experience and sharing them and learning from each other. At the beginning of the panel, Father Harold was reminding us that the word obedience, or to obey, comes from Latin, and it means to listen to others, not just to be passive. And I think what I like in this panel is we insisted on the pluralism dimension, that it's not about as taking a Mapuche person and shaping her into a good, westernized person, but to really give the opportunity to develop her or his potential linked to the culture from which the person comes. And to bring boys and girls together. It's not only girls that are going to displace boys, but it's how do we construct high education systems where everybody feels that she or he belongs. So thank you so much for this sharing your experience, and keep up the great job that you are all doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it in this program, in half an hour or 20 minutes, there is another session on what works in equity, which is very similar to this morning's session if you are interested to pursue the learning and sharing on this topic.
Muchas gracias.